Good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Corio, and this is Podcasting with a Purpose, a virtual workshop offered to you by me with financial support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So thank you to them for helping us provide this resource to our community. Today's workshop will involve you and your creative thinking. The goals of this workshop are to help you conceptualize a podcast. And I can only see about half of the participants, but maybe a show of hands, or you can use the little hand icon. Anyone in here already podcasting? No. Okay. All right. Anyone in here wanting to start a podcast? Show of hands. Yay. Okay, good. Glad you're here. So the goals of today's workshop are, again, to help you conceptualize a podcast. I could spend an entire 2-hour workshop on getting into the details of content and interviewing and voice delivery, for example. So today, though, is more about big picture. I want you to come away with a solid idea and direction for where you can go with your podcast idea. And you will also come away with some basic skills as well. But I'm going to take you through a 3-step process in the workshop to help you develop your podcast idea. And then we're going to finish up again with some basic skills. First, I want to introduce myself, though, and allow you all to get to know each other a little bit better and to introduce you more generally to the idea of podcasting. So as I said before, my name is Emily Corio, and I teach journalism at West Virginia University in the Reed College of Media. I recently created and started teaching a course on podcasting, which is a lot of fun, and it fills very quickly, and the students are enjoying it as well. I've been producing audio journalism for 2 decades, and I'm still a journalist and do stories and sometimes for podcasts on a freelance basis. So I have a lot of experience in the audio journalism area, and I'm excited to share that with you all today, and especially to talk about podcasting. This is really an exciting time to be in podcasting. So I will begin first by sharing my screen with you. And I do have a presentation I am going to go through today and kind of jump out of it at times so that we can do those breakout sessions. Okay, so everybody's doing it, right? Podcasting is certainly popular right now. There's a lot of noise out there in the media landscape. Even Roscoe, the dog here, considers recording a podcast. So with all that noise in the media landscape, you really need to think creatively and strategically when you're developing your podcast idea. You really have to make yourself stand out. But it's not just about new ideas. You might have an idea to cover something that someone is already covering, but you might have a new way to approach it. And that's great too. That would be coming at it with a fresh idea. And that could also help you stand out. Before we can start doing some work around your podcast ideas, I want you to take a moment and I want you to think about purpose. I want you to think about why you want to create a podcast. And I am going to step out of screen sharing for a moment here and put a link, my first link, in the chat. And I want you to click on this, please, when you see it pop up in the chat. And I want you to go to this Google Jamboard. And I want you to post a sticky note, at least one. You can do more than one, with what is your purpose. And I don't want you to think very specifically about your idea for your podcast. I just want you to think about why. Why are you wanting to do this? So go ahead and get to the Jamboard. I see that people are joining now, and go ahead and put your purpose for podcasting on that Jamboard. Okay, we have a couple of reasons. Demystify public service, connect with a community of listeners. You know, working, okay, health and wellness. Okay, make sure my faculty partners don't bite off more than they can chew. Um, great. Looking for a new, better way to share cancer information. Yeah. And I think too, just looking for a new, better way to share information, right, is probably a reason that many people turn to podcasting, no matter what that information is. A way to connect with students, faculty, and staff at WVU and other universities. I just want to make sure we don't have too many stacked on top of each other here. Okay. Okay. No one put fun. Does anyone want to just do this because they think it's going to be a blast? Okay. So everyone's getting into, some, yes, fun. Okay, good. Someone wants to do it for fun. That's good. That's good because you have to bring passion. You have to bring the passion. Okay. Well, what I want to do now is I want to have us go into our first breakout room session. And I want you in this session to use this as an opportunity to introduce yourself to other people in the workshop this morning and to tell them about your purpose. And again, you don't have to get into specifics because you might not know specifics just yet about your podcast. And that's the point of the workshop, right? Is to help you wrap your arms around that. But you have a good sense of why you want to do this. And so I want you to share that. I want you to share your purpose with your group. And this is a great opportunity too to network with some people on campus who want to do something similar to what you want to do. So we'll go into this first breakout room. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you got to know each other and were able to do some networking about your podcast ideas. So before we get into that 3-step development process that I talked about earlier, I do just want to touch on kind of where we are with podcasting right now, the history and the trends. So this has been called the golden age of podcasting. Originally, podcasting, when it was first created and defined in the early aughts, it was considered digital audio files that could be downloaded and were associated with subscription feeds that would allow future files to be automatically downloaded. Really, that's evolved. Now, as you likely know, you don't have to download a podcast, right, to listen to it. So that's a difference. But also, some podcasts also now include video. Some people live stream their podcasting on Facebook or record it and post it to a website later. So the definition is more fluid right now. But one thing is certain, and that's podcasts are episodic audio content focused on people sharing information and or providing entertainment. Podcasting is growing too. This is really an exciting time to get into podcasting. So the statistics here show you that listenership is growing and that more podcasts are being created than ever before. So again, just a really exciting time to be experimenting and to be thinking about doing something in this medium. Why are podcasts so popular? Well, they're convenient for one thing. It's on demand and it's really tailored to our needs and our interest. When I got a puppy, I guess it was a year and a half ago now, I had never actually owned a puppy before, and I'd always adopted older dogs. And so I searched for podcast. How do I raise a puppy? What do I need to do? And I would just listen to these short little podcasts. So they were very useful for me and clearly very tailored to my need. I've also read that self-help podcasts were more frequently listened to in 2020 during the pandemic, right? Everybody's looking for a little tidbit of information to kind of help them cope with the pandemic and to get through the pandemic. So we can find podcasts that really suit our needs and our interest. And I think that is why they are so popular with listeners today. I do want to just before I go to that, share with you some samples of podcasts. Or if you're here in this workshop, you listen to some of your own that you enjoy. But I want to share some with you that I think are very well done, and we can talk about why. And I think that this will help you have a good grasp of what makes compelling podcast content. So let's listen to I'm dropping us into about 3/4 of the way into a podcast, a recent episode from This American Life. Let's take a listen.
This law is known as the top 10% rule, because the way it worked when they started was that if you were in the top 10% of your high school class, you were automatically admitted to UT Austin. Since then, the percentage of students has gone down. Now it is the top 6% of your class, but it works the same. It doesn't matter what you get in your SAT. If you're in the top of your class, you're in. So what you end up with is the top students from rich suburban high schools around Dallas and rural towns in West Texas and Latino majority schools in the Rio Grande Valley. And it makes for a very different freshman class at UT than you would see at most state flagship colleges. And it also makes it an especially interesting place to ask a question that's relevant now as we contemplate whether to bring back the SAT after the pandemic. What happens if you just ignore a student's test scores? What happens if you admit students with great grades from a variety of high schools who do well in the classroom, but not on the SAT? Students like Daniela. Well, turns out admitting students based only on their grades, their class rank, from high schools all over the state makes UT a very different university from others in some significant and interesting ways. Paul explains.
When I was reporting my book, I spent a lot of time at UT, and I met a lot of students there who'd been admitted with excellent high school grades and lower test scores. Yvonne I met on the first day of her freshman calculus class. She was from the west side of San Antonio, a neighborhood where no one had much money, a high school where teachers kept leaving in the middle of the year. In many ways, her story was just like Daniela's. She was number 2 in her class, but her SAT score was only so-so. In her case, though, her test score didn't make her question her identity and her self-worth like it did for Daniela.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there and ask you if anyone wants to put in the chat or just to speak out about why you think this podcast, This American Life, is so popular. What do you think it is about this podcast that makes so many people come back to it time and again? And Jesse, if you'll help me out with the chat, since I'm sharing my screen. Is it Maja?
Maya. Yeah.
Maya, sorry.
Sorry, I have horrible video at home. So,
that's fine.
So I think part of it is actually the different voices that you hear in it that This American Life does. And you can hear that in that clip.
And it's good audio quality too. So yes. Anything else?
In the chat, Michael says they do an excellent job of picking stories and topics that are very widely identifiable to audience members.
Yes, that's very true too. I agree. Anything else? Anyone else have an idea about why this is such a popular podcast and is really seen as, the star example of narrative, of the narrative style of podcasting? So the writing is also exceptional if you really listen to the writing. which allows for the delivery to be very conversational. You'll also notice some things in this that are different than you would hear in a news story. The reporter is referred to as their first name, by their first name. Second person is used frequently. The second person perspective. So those are some things that make this podcast more conversational and makes you as a listener feel like they're really talking to you. It makes it a really intimate experience. And then there's also the layering of sound that's done really well in all of these episodes. It's really a composition when you think about how the voices come together and the music in the background. Okay, now I'm going to play a little bit of another one for you. And I had this one queued up. Here we are.
Pfizer's COVID vaccine is authorized for 12 to 15-year-olds.
The vaccine was 100% effective.
So they're the next target in the country's vaccination effort.
But how long before adolescents can actually get their shots?
I'm Steve Inskeep with Rachel Martin, and this is Up First from NPR News. Israelis and Palestinians confront one another on the ground. Rockets and warplanes hurtle through the sky.
All sides need to de-escalate.
Although for the last few days, they've gone the other direction. How did the conflict escalate so quickly?
And nearly half of U.S. oil supply on the East Coast is in jeopardy following a massive...
And we'll stop that one there. So very different feel, right, than This American Life. But a different purpose for this podcast. This is your daily news. So this is, you can go to this every morning and hear the top stories of the day, right? It's moving faster. And the voices are coming in and out faster. And those were all the teases, right, to what then is going to go into really what's kind of a Q&A format for this podcast. But it does have a different feel because it is a news podcast. And as such, it's not going to have that kind of more relaxed storytelling feel that This American Life has. I want to play a little bit of another podcast with you, and this one is a good program. The whole podcast are very interesting. Work Life with Adam Grant, but what I have been struck by is how these branded content pieces in the middle of these podcasts really are not, I don't want to say bad to listen to, but when you think, okay, someone's advertising to me, you might be like, oh, okay, whatever, just get back to the podcast. And these always surprise me because initially I think, oh, we're taking a break, here's another ad. But he always has a way of pulling me into these little branded content stories. And these are the ads in his show. So just take a listen to how he handles that kind of content.
Yep, demeaning is a problem. What if you could get rid of it altogether? Is it possible to create a workplace with no assholes? More on that after the break. Okay, this is going to be a different kind of ad. I played a personal role in selecting the sponsors for this podcast because they all have interesting cultures of their own. Today, we're going inside the workplace at Bonobos. Dee Fuchs remembers the first time Carla and her husband Aaron walked into his Bonobo shop in Scottsdale. Carla was on a mission.
So he was on the hunt to really trim down his pants.
She'd been in the store before and told Dee she was trying to change her husband's look, but he wasn't having it. If she ever got him in there, Carla said, she and Dee had to team up and seize the day.
Carla loved for Aaron to wear some of the brighter, more fun prints. Aaron was a little more conservative and liked some of the more plain patterns. So there was that fun little battle between them.
Carla won. And that first visit was the beginning of a routine. Aaron and Carla would go golfing together, grab some lunch, and then come into Bonobos and shop.
They'd always have this playful back and forth. And there was always that fun exchange of Carla pushing the boundary and Aaron realigning and resetting, like where that line is drawn in the sand.
Everyone in the store loved watching them together. They seemed like a real team.
You know, when you see a couple who loves each other that much, it gives you hope in more ways than one. And I think they had an effect on all of us in the shop.
There's evidence that customers find ongoing service relationships more satisfying than one-off encounters with a different provider each time. But building that relationship isn't always easy. At Bonobos, the guides in their shops are encouraged to make meaningful connections with customers, while of course respecting their boundaries. As Aaron and Carla became regulars, they developed a real bond with Dee.
It extended much more than just, a customer. They were kind of like family in a way.
But sometimes even regulars take a break. Months went by where Dee didn't see Carla and Aaron. He didn't really think too much of it. Then one day, Aaron walked into the store.
He'd come in and said, hey, I haven't been in a while, and I kind of wanted to get resized because I've lost some weight.
Dee went to pull up Aaron's purchase history, which was under Carla's name, and he suddenly had a sinking feeling about why Aaron was shopping alone.
It was almost like crazy feeling just dawned on me. I feel like I intuitively just knew, man, everything in me just kind of dropped.
Carla had passed away a few months earlier of breast cancer. It had been quick, only a month after she was diagnosed with a recurrence. Dee offered his condolences and asked Aaron how he was holding up.
He smiled, and it was one of those where you can tell there was, some pain behind it, but to feel his strength and to feel his positive energy was indescribable.
Aaron was just there for some everyday shopping, but he happened to mention that he had a black tie event later that week. He'd lost a lot of weight, so his tux didn't fit, and he was just going to rent one. After Aaron left the store, Dee leapt into action. He'd noticed Aaron admiring a particular tux, the capstone Italian wool in navy. So he rush ordered the tux as a surprise gift to Aaron. It arrived on Aaron's doorstep the next day, along with a letter signed by everyone at the store. That afternoon, Dee's phone rang.
Hey, how's it going, Aaron? And his response was, what do you mean, how's it going? Like, man, I can't believe you guys did this. And he was just floored. It was one of the most heartfelt thank yous I can remember ever getting in my life.
It's what you do, Dee says, when you believe in the idea that customer relations really are about just that, a relationship.
We hope that, you'll get,
Okay, so we'll stop there. So again, these are just a couple of minute long stories, and I wanted to play the whole thing for you so you could see how they took this story and really drilled it down into like 2 or 3 minutes long. And you have the whole narrative style of story right there, right? And it's an effective way to share branded content, which might be one of the reasons some of you are here, is because you work for an organization that wants you to podcast, that wants you to promote its brand. So I think that what Adam Grant is doing in these Work Life with Adam Grant podcasts for these companies is pretty remarkable. And I think the companies must really like it because this podcast is very successful as well. And then the last one I want to play for you, it gives you more of an example about monologue. And we're going to talk about the different formats in a little bit, but I just want you to hear the intro to this podcast called Finding Fred.
Have you ever tried to explain this world to children? I have kids, 2 of them. Have you ever sat down with a kid and tried to explain why there are Nazis marching in the exact place where you took them to the farmer's market and waited in line for pupusas? Have you ever tried to explain how a person who lies, assaults, insults, grifts, fakes, and hates can be elected into one of the most powerful jobs in the world? Have you ever tried to explain to them why they should be good people, how they should be good people in a world where there is so much bad, where they see people who look like them shot by police, murdered by vigilantes, run over at rallies? I have. And even though my whole job as a writer involves being so-called good with words, there are no words good enough to explain why things are the way they are and what we should do about it. It's too much. It's too big. It's too overwhelming. Maybe you don't have kids. Maybe you don't have to make this world make sense to children. So I ask you, how then do you make sense of it to yourself? Do you hide? Do you tell yourself that everything is fine? Do you convince yourself that you're doing everything you can? And do you make excuses for when you're not? I mean, do you know what to do? Like today, like right now in this moment, to help? Do you know how to be a good person? Are you a good person? Because me, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about any of us.
Okay, so a really provocative intro, right, to that podcast by Carvel Wallace, and he is a writer, and so you can see, his strong writing coming through there. Lots of questions, though. And I generally tell students who are writing news stories, don't ask questions of your audience. We answer questions as journalists. We shouldn't be asking them. But podcast, and particularly a podcast about a concept as wide as empathy, right? And can be as abstract as empathy in some ways, can be thought-provoking and can be provocative like that. And so you heard a lot of second-person perspective again, talking to you, the listener. You also heard in that a very effective use of delivery, voice delivery. So your voice delivery is how you sound when you speak on the medium, and it was effective because of the quality of the audio, for one, and for all of these examples, the audio quality has been exceptional, right? But also the pace and the use of silence. So I want you to think about those things too. And again, I could do another workshop just probably on voice delivery. So we're not going to get too deep into that, but I wanted to just start today by sharing some examples of podcasts just to get you thinking about what makes a good podcast and what makes good content. So let me get out of this now and go back to the presentation. So as you continue to think about podcasting and your future podcast, I want you to think about it with an entrepreneurial mindset. So this means embrace your creativity, activate it by being curious and being observant. Consider how you can address an audience's needs through a podcast. Okay, going back to my example about getting the puppy. Okay, what is your podcast doing for your audience? You want to make sure you're addressing an audience need. Act soon. So act soon, then figure out what worked, what didn't work, and then change it moving forward. And bring your passion, because you're going to need it for a project like this. This is work. This will take effort. So you need to enjoy it to some degree if you're going to be doing it. Okay. Any questions so far? Do we have any questions in the chat? No. Okay. So I just want to show you, as we're thinking about entrepreneurialism and podcasting, I want to share a few examples with you about several people who have done this really well. So How I Built This is a podcast created by Guy Raz, and he used to host the TED Radio Hour, and then he started How I Built This, and that really took off. And so that is what his main gig is now. And he says it's about building something that connects with people. So think about that as you're thinking about your podcast. It needs to connect with your audience. Side Hustle Pro is a podcast that was started by a digital marketer. And she says specifically about podcasting, it is something that has a relatively low startup cost, but not many people understand how to market themselves. So you have to figure out who your ideal listener is and connect with them online. So do some audience research, or your show won't grow. So that's talking really about promoting and making sure, again, that you're addressing those audience needs. And then the Tim Ferriss show, he was a blogger turned podcaster. And he says, I love podcasting because it's a mass audience format that offers 100% creative control with low production cost. So that's an introduction into podcasting and the opportunity that exists currently for podcasting. So I just want you to keep in mind that podcasting is an accessible space, and entrepreneurial thinking will expose opportunities that are in this space. So we're going to now get into this 3-step process of developing your podcast. So I want to first start with some podcast genres. So according to data from last fall, comedy is actually the most listened to podcast genre, with 22% of listeners surveyed saying that they tune in to comedy podcast. But it's followed closely by news, with 21% of those surveyed saying they listen to news podcast, and then true crime at 18%, sports at 17% of listeners, and health and fitness at 17%. Scripted drama was among the lowest, but it still showed up in these ratings. And some other genres that you may tune into and find podcasts about include religion, spirituality, self-help, investigative journalism, and the nonfiction narrative. And genres can certainly overlap. So I want you to think now about what genre are you trying to produce a podcast for? Which of these buckets would it fit into? I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and put in the chat a resource that I've created for you that you can use today as we go through this workshop. So if you can click on this document, and if you can download this document, that will be most helpful to you. So what I want you to do now with this document is I want you to look at the first breakout session on podcast genres. And I want you to think about what genre your podcast falls into. And after you answer that question, I want you to think about what opportunities exist for your podcast in that genre. What also is the competition that may exist? So I want you to really think about audience and competition. And then I want you to discuss this in your breakout group. And so again, we'll go back to our breakout groups for about 8 minutes, answer those questions first on that prompt, and then you can discuss your answers with your group. Okay, so now that you should feel pretty good about the genre that you hope your podcast falls into, I want to have you think about the theme for your podcast. So focus on a theme within your podcast genre. You probably have an idea, and based on your comments on the Jamboard, it seems like a lot of you have really great ideas about what your themes are for your podcast programs. But what I want you to do next is actually to write a focus statement for your podcast. So you should have a focus statement for your overall podcast, your show, your program, and then you should have one for each episode. That really tells us the subject, who is doing the action, what is the action, and why your audience should care. And I always say that focus statements should be statements that are not questions. So if you're still asking a question, then you need to do more research on what it is that you really want to cover. So I give you an example about the focus statement for Side Hustle Pro, that podcast that I referenced earlier as a great example of a podcast that really utilized entrepreneurial thinking. And what I would say the overall podcast focus statement is the first and only podcast to spotlight bold Black women entrepreneurs who have scaled from side hustle to profitable business. So that tells you the gist of what this podcast is all about. So anytime you tune into a program, you're going to be hearing something that fits with that theme. Then if we want to think about a focus statement for a specific episode, so in particular for episode 237 of Side Hustle Pro, the focus statement would be a new mom turned entrepreneur talks about how she created an e-commerce baby products company that celebrates African culture. So it's really helpful to have these focus statements because they will remind you what your purpose is for your program overall and for each episode. So I want to now have us jump back into those breakout rooms. And you are going to go back to that sheet that you hopefully downloaded, that Google Doc. You can click on it in the chat again if you need to go back to it. But if you go back to that Google Doc, then you will see that the next breakout session prompts are about theme and about focus. So I want you to take a look at those prompts and yes, I see someone's in there now. Okay. So if you can download the worksheet and then work on it on your own computer, that would be great. But figure out what your theme is. Write a focus statement about the theme for your show, and then discuss that with your group. Welcome back, everyone. We just have one more breakout session, and then we're going to move on to the how-to portion of the workshop. So the last step in this 3-step development process is thinking about your format that you want to have for your podcast. And it's important that you maintain a consistent format. Listeners appreciate that consistency. You hear that with all of the podcasts that you likely listen to. You know, it could be a Q&A where there's a host who brings guests on and asks them questions, like the Work Life with Adam Grant podcast that I played an example from earlier. So it's a lot of him asking questions. There is some scripted elements to that one as well, but it's a good bit of Q&A. The monologue is where the host would read scripted content. Or a producer would read scripted content. And we heard that from Carvel Wallace with the Finding Fred. A panel may be a good podcast format for your idea. So this is where you would have one or perhaps two hosts interviewing a panel of guests. We talked earlier about the narrative form, and you hear that with This American Life. And you even hear that in those little short branded content examples that I played for you as well in that Work Life with Adam Grant. So certainly podcasts can have a combination of formats, but again, I think it's really important that you stick with a consistent format so that your listeners know what to expect when they tune into your show. What should influence your podcast format? Your content first and foremost, right? If you have the elements of a good story, and you're a strong writer, and you can collect the different sounds that you need to have a scripted narrative story, then that's probably the format that you should go with is a narrative format for your podcast. If you have a really strong guest who has insightful, interesting things to say, stories to share, and you're a very good interviewer, then maybe a Q&A makes the most sense for your podcast format. So characters and guests can also drive what type of format you want to choose for your podcast. And then you will also influence what kind of format you should choose. Again, I've mentioned, are you a good interviewer? Are you a strong writer? These kinds of things would speak to your strengths. in terms of what format you should use. So we're going to go into a breakout session one last time. The last prompt on the Google Doc worksheet is about format. What format do you think will work best for your podcast? Why? And what obstacles do you see with that format? What obstacles might you see with the podcast overall that you would like to address? So let's go back into those breakout rooms one last time for 8 minutes and have a conversation about format. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So hopefully you have had a chance in these breakout sessions to really build on your idea to gain some new resources and contacts in the podcasting arena. So the rest of the session today, we're going to get into a bit of the how-to, the basics of podcasting. I just put a link in the chat that you can go to with some resources for recording and editing. So you can actually see in that document a list of the equipment that I actually use from home. And it's a great setup. I've been really happy with it. And I can even take this and go into the field too with this setup with just one additional microphone. And I also gave you an estimate of the cost as well. And I do need to credit the IDEA Faculty Fellowship under the direction of Dr. Carrie White for allowing me to get this set up at home. I was able to do so with the stipend that that fellowship provides. So that was very helpful. So what you'll need, this is a very basic list for recording. You'll need a microphone, at least one, possibly more, depending on how you're going to do your setup, a good pair of headphones, a recording device, and that could be your computer. You know, you could have it to where your mic is going directly into your computer. My setup is that I have this recorder / mixer, and it's made by the company Zoom, not to be confused with the video platform Zoom. But I can use this mixer, and my mic is going into that mixer and then going into the computer. And if I wanted to, I could have my audio editing software open. Adobe Audition is the one I use, and I could be recording my voice directly into Audition. And with this Zoom mixer, I also can bring in someone on my cell phone. So I could have a conversation with someone on my cell phone, and I could bring their audio into Adobe Audition while also bringing my audio in through this microphone. So it's a very handy setup for sure. And you can also use Zoom. You know, you can just pull the audio from Zoom if you're having some sort of Zoom conversation. I have used that before for audio stories, especially this past year when I wasn't able to go out into the field. I was using Zoom as my audio recording tool, and I was pulling the audio from that. I also have, in a pinch, asked people, when I'm talking to them on the phone, do you have an extra phone that you can record yourself into while we're talking? So they hold a phone, talk into it, record themselves, and then they send me that audio. And then I can use that audio in my audio pieces. Any questions about setup?
Was everybody able to? I think because we posted the link early, some folks couldn't see the resource list. I reposted it in the chat. Is everybody able to see that, or anybody not able to see that, I should say? Okay.
Okay, great. And so editing, you have some options. So Audacity is a free program, and it's fairly, if you know your way around Adobe Audition or Pro Tools, you can find your way around Audacity. Adobe Audition, again, is the one I use. I've also used Pro Tools in the past, and I would say Adobe Audition and Pro Tools are ones that are pretty industry standard. So now I want to take you into Adobe Audition. And it looks like it closed on me since I had it open. So let me see here if I can get back to it. And I had a lot of files in there. So if you've never used Audition, then you'll get to see how you can bring them in. I also want to share with you a couple of audio files. So if you want to try your hand at editing, let me stop sharing for a moment so that I can put some links in the chat. So those are links to 2 audio files. So if you've never edited audio before, these are some files that you can play with during this session. So one is a file of a story that a student did last year in my podcasting class, and the other is a track of music. So you can go and download those now. And if you have an audio editing program, feel free to bring those into that program. Okay, let me share again. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I will go and find those files myself. Okay, and they are in my podcasting class. And here is the story that the student did. And then I will bring in the music. So Adobe puts your files over here on the left-hand side, and I'm currently in the one that is highlighted in blue. And if I press my space bar, you should hear the story.
Senior year, a year that's supposed to be full of exciting memories.
And we're having that audio issue we had talked about, Jesse, where Adobe Audition isn't letting the sound come through. So I will just kind of talk you through this anyways. It's not essential that you hear this crisply. So here is some music. So I just double clicked on that. You probably recognize that song. It's a popular one this time of year. Okay, so this story is about senior year coming to a close during the pandemic. So let's say I'm just going to show you a real simple way to mix. We talked about how sound is layered. You hear that a lot in podcasts that are well produced. You hear this kind of layered sound between voices and music. So I just want to show you quickly what that looks like. So I'm just going to start a multi-track session. So I can just put my music over here in the first track, and then I can put my story down here. And let's say that I want the music to play for a little while before, and by a little while, I mean a couple of seconds before you hear the reporter start to talk. Also, the music, there's some crackling in the beginning of the file. So I'm going to shorten it. So I just kind of grab it. I'm clicking with my mouse. I grab it. I kind of shorten it there. I didn't want to shorten it that much. Can pull it back. Take it back to the beginning. Move this down a little and play to see what it sounds like.
Senior year, a year that's supposed to be full of exciting memories.
So that is not how you would leave it, because clearly the music is competing with the voice and the story. So the music can help set the tone, but then I've got to fade that music down. So you create keyframes so you can see when the person starts talking. I need this music to be fading. So I can create some keyframes and I can start to bring that level of that music down.
That's supposed to be full of exciting memories like prom and graduation.
So it's probably still a little too loud. I would bring it down even more. And then I would need to go through here and find at what point do I want that music to cut out totally.
It's safe to say say that no one expected the repercussions.
And sometimes I like to do it when a new voice comes in.
For seniors at Parkersburg South High School, events have been postponed with no definite dates given. Though I'm not a senior myself, I'm back home with my younger sister Juliet, who's supposed to be experiencing all the fun involved with her senior year of high school. She and myself never knew it would come to this. So how did you...
Okay, so I would definitely want the music to be out by then, but I may even pop it out earlier, by doing another keyframe, another complete fade out when she changes subject, for example, in her sentence. And you want that fade to be smooth. We want it to be really easy on the ears.
Though I'm not a senior myself,
I would even make it longer, right? So it's really an art when you get in here and you start messing with your sound and adjusting your levels and working with fades. But you really, I harp on my students all the time, use that fade option. It's so much easier on the ears. Times where I wouldn't use fade is if it's a very distinct noise that, has a very clear start and stop. Obviously, you wouldn't need to fade that. It is nice to have that music up for a little bit in the beginning, just again, to help kind of set the tone. And it's nice to use music in the middle of a podcast. We call those interstitials, and it adds an element that gives people time to absorb what you've just told them and time to kind of think. So this was just one story that a student did. I want to show you what the podcast looks like. I'm going to bring in the actual multi-track session from the podcast. I don't want to show you the mix down. I want to show you the session. Okay. So it's really zoomed in. I'm going to zoom it out here. And so you can just see the different elements of sound that I was working with. And I have it in 3 tracks, and that's because I even do a good bit of producing before I bring it into multi-track. I actually make sure stories are edited together before I bring them into the multi-track. So these purple files are complete stories, right? That may already have sound mixed into them in terms of other voices, right? And then the yellow are different stories. So some of these tracks are like the host intro, goes right into a story, host intro. This is the second story, then host intro, third story, et cetera, et cetera. And then these are my music interstitials. So I'll just play this for you so you can kind of see what it looks like as it plays. And I'm sorry you can't hear it through the computer.
Welcome back to our 3rd episode of High Street Beat. But you should know, unlike our first 2 episodes, this one has nothing to do with High Street in Morgantown, West Virginia. You see, we're mostly not Morgantown. West Virginia University moved classes online last month. So we're reporting from our homes about the ways we see coronavirus affecting our communities. So in this episode, who let the dogs out? Canceling prom. Canceling graduation too. We're going to Disney World, except there's coronavirus, and finding faith online. Welcome to our special episode. Since the beginning of social distancing.
Okay, so you can see as Maxwell starts to talk, the music fades down. It's still there, doesn't go away. Then it pops back up for what we call full music or ambient sound full for a second or two, fades back down. And then as he gets into the first story, it's gone. The music is gone before we hear the first reporter speaking. Okay, I will. Any questions about editing audio? I also shared a link to some Audition tutorials so that you can look at those if you're new to editing audio. And I know some of you are not new to editing audio, but I just wanted to share that in case that is something very new for some of you. But there are some tutorials in that equipment resource sheet that I shared in the chat. Okay. Once you have your podcast ready to go, you need to think about where it will live. So I use SoundCloud. I know a student of mine who does her own podcasting. She really likes Anchor. These are some other options. There are lots of hosting platforms that you can choose from. SoundCloud is free. I do have a paid subscription to it just so that I can upload larger files and more content. So that does become an issue in terms of the free account if you plan on putting up a lot of content. I have a link here that talks more about how to get your podcast onto platforms so that people can hear it, because what's the point, right, if we don't share it and no one hears it? And then once you have your podcast, you really need to measure how it does, right? And if it didn't do as well as you wanted it to, you think about why that is. So audience engagement is very important when you're producing podcasts. You can produce a beautiful podcast, but if no one listens to it, then really, other than you maybe having some fun and self-satisfaction, what is the purpose, right? So you want people to listen to your podcast. So Anchor, the hosting platform I just mentioned, has a good list. And there's also a website link that I'll put in the chat here in just a moment that will take you to some good resources for how to get out there with your podcast, how to connect with your audience. These are just some of those ways that you can grow your podcast. With my students, I make sure that their podcast goes on SoundCloud and then that they use social media to share links to the podcast, and that they have relevant hashtags, and that they tag relevant people and they tweet at relevant people who can then help share that podcast, who would not only want to listen to it themselves, but who would also want to share it. And so we talk about having language in your social media posts that's like a teaser that would make someone want to listen, right? Not just, hey, check out my new podcast, right? But have you ever wondered about X, Y, or Z? Well, listen to this podcast. People like lists. They like when they know that things are coming to them in a list format. So if your podcast includes 3 steps to improve your sleep, then put that in your social media post and listen to the podcast now.
I just want to pause 1 second. Heather asked a question about GarageBand in the chat. If people use GarageBand for podcasting, I answered. I've used it in the past. It's a good program to get started on. I will say it doesn't have a lot of the add-ons, and as you get into sort of some of the different mixed formats, and if you're recording straight into it, it doesn't have some of the filter options that Audition or some of the other programs have. But that's just my personal take on it, Heather.
Yeah, I don't use GarageBand, so I can't really speak to that, but I can speak to what Jesse is saying about Audition having those additional filters, like EQ and normalize. I mean, I'm usually going in, particularly this past year when we've had some kind of wacky audio setups, to try and help improve the audio quality. I think the best thing is to record it well going in initially, but it definitely helps with some of these programs that have some more sophisticated options for cleaning up audio before you share it.
And also, I just want to go back just a little bit to when you were showing Audition, when you were talking about keyframes and how to sort of, if you're new to audio editing, the equivalent of that in Audacity, if you're using the free program Audacity, is the envelope tool. So it's that's what that that's how you get that same function in Audacity that you saw in Audition.
Great. Well, I will stop there and give you all the opportunity to ask some questions as we finish up the workshop. And I will stop sharing, and I will also put the link that I promised from Anchor that I referenced in that second to last slide in the chat now. And again, that's how to grow your podcast audience. So do we have any questions?
So Emily, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This is Maya. So how, I'm guessing, looking around the room, my guess is that many of us are involved with the university community here at WU. How do we start small?
Yeah, so actually this goes back to something that was discussed in a breakout session when I popped into, I think it was group 2. They were talking about timing. So I think starting small, I think we should probably talk about timing, right? And it can actually sometimes be more difficult to keep it short. I think Mark Twain often gets credited with this quote, but I don't actually think it's a Mark Twain quote. I think it was, what is it? It's, I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have time. So something to that effect. Sometimes cutting your audio down can actually be more work. But I would start small in terms of your length. I make my students keep it to 10 minutes when they did their own podcast. And most of them went for a Q&A format. I made them interview at least 2 people, even if only one showed up in their final podcast. I said, you have to talk to at least 2 people. And you have to make sure that the person you talk to is interesting and people are going to want to listen to them. But that's how a lot of them started off, was with a scripted intro. They wrote out some questions, but then they just let the conversation flow. And then they had a scripted ending. So I would limit yourself in time, and certainly, a Q&A format is going to be one of the easier formats to pull off. Doesn't mean it's going to sound the best, but if we're thinking about easy entry, I think that's going to be the easiest entry point.
And if I can, and I'll introduce myself. I'm Jesse Wright. I'm also a faculty at the Reed College of Media. I have some background in audio production as well. But the other thing there, I think, is keeping your length short will help you with audience growth building. It'll help you to focus your content. But I think also, if you want to launch a podcast, the shorter it is, the less bandwidth you eat up. And so a lot of those platforms will base your fees on bandwidth used, how many downloads you got, so length will affect that as well, and it may affect your startup costs, and that's something that you want to do some research into. My advice would be to start free with something like Audacity and SoundCloud. And then if you see an opportunity, what you don't want to get into the situation is that you sort of tied to these monthly costs that can accumulate if you don't have a way to offset those costs. So there's lots of free options out there. I would say take advantage of those and then see where it goes. What is your growth based on? Can you get support? Can you add sponsorships to make it a viable product? And then, so small is good for a variety of different kind of areas in podcasting, I think.
Any other questions?
Hey, Emily. I was curious if there's aside from the amount of listeners that subscribe, how do we know this is successful? Like, is there a measure of success that you all have of like, I mean, if 5 people subscribe, I feel like I'm very excited about that, but I know that that's not like, is there a metrics to success?
Well, I think that really depends, right, on what is your goal, I think that it's a competitive landscape, right? There are lots of podcasts out there, and people have lots of options. And if you're just starting out, then it's going to take a while to build audience, to get people to listen. So that's where using those tactics to really reach out to people are going to be so important. I do an audience engagement assignment in my podcasting class where I make them post to social media and then wait a couple of days and then post again and then measure, okay, how many impressions did you get? How many people actually clicked through and listened to it? And I think they're often surprised that really not a lot of people listened. They get excited. Hey, somebody liked my tweet, and that's a start. That's a start, right? But we do have to get people there, and we do have to get people listening to it. So I think you have to kind of decide, what are your goals? What are reasonable goals, right, for what you're trying to do? And of course, you will always want to grow those numbers, but set some reasonable goals for yourself. And then, think about those audience engagement tactics as to how you can continue to grow those numbers. And when you're first starting out, it's going to be small. It's going to be small.
And I'll just say a note here on folks getting started, that don't shortchange yourself on your early content, because as your audience grows, your audience will just naturally loop back to the beginning of your content. So, a lot of people put a lot more resources into the more recent episodes and sort of script it in more intentionally, and they see it as something beyond an experiment, beyond a startup. And just remember that as you grow audience, they will want to hear that earlier content. So if that makes sense. So if you keep your theme, keep your structure very consistent, regardless of your audience. So maybe think about it as designing your content for the audience that you want to eventually have, because they will find you, eventually. It's a very slow process, though.
Well, thank you, everyone, for spending a couple of hours with us today in this workshop. I hope that it's been beneficial to you, and I hope that you have a lot of success with your podcast endeavors. So feel free to reach out. I put my email in the presentation, and we'll also, in a follow-up email, be sharing that with you. So if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out.